This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonnet. This week it's the two of us in the studio, and we are answering a question that's been asked over the years in different forms, but basically is what are the differences and similarities between art and architecture? Are they the same? Or the similarities and differences between artists and architects? Do they practice the same? Do they think the same? And that was the discussion. There wasn't a particular order to this discussion because we had some loose ideas, but we mostly winged it. So let's get lost in this rabbit hole together. Sponsors. One of the best tools we've come across for project management and specifications is Programma, a remarkable all-in-one suite of bespoke tools for interior designers. With Programma, you can create schedules, mood boards, and invoices. It also allows you to share all of your project information with builders, trades, and clients with their very useful client dashboard. Projects can get complicated, but Programma makes it easy, saving you time so you can focus on design. Start thriving with Programma by clicking the link in our episode notes and use the code SECONDSTUDIO to save 25% off your annual subscription. One of the easiest ways to get accurate existing conditions of houses is with an iPhone and iPad app called Canvas. Canvas is a tool we use on many of our projects. Instead of surveying the home manually, we simply scan it using our iPad, and Canvas processes the scan to produce accurate drawings and even 3D computer models. The file formats work with AutoCAD, ArchiCAD, Revit, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. It's extremely easy to use, really fast, and has been a huge benefit for us and our clients. Try it out by visiting canvas.io/SSP or click the link in our show notes to learn more.
If you're still using AutoCAD and separate 3D modeling program, then let me just tell you, stop that. Get with the times, people, and advance to a BIM computer program. The program we recommend is ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD leads the industry by enabling architecture and interior design firms around the world to 3D design. It's supported by innovative technology that expands as far as the imagination can stretch. As ArchiCAD continues to evolve with technological advances, architects can push that technology to their advantage while working in an accurate model. You can start your fully functioning free trial today by clicking the link in our episode notes.
This is The Second Studio with myself and Marina. Here we go. If I were a young architecture student and I'm in a lecture hall and you're at the front of the stage and I say to you, "Oh, guest speaker Marina, I have a question for you about architecture." And you say, "Yeah, ask me the question." And I say, "What?"
I'd be like, "No, please don't ask your question."
What are the differences between art and architecture? How are they different or are they the same? I'm confused. I'm a confused student.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're a third year in architecture school and you've been learning about architecture for the last 3 years, you should have some sort of idea of the differences. But if you don't, I'm happy to help. There is a lot, I think. There is a lot of differences. There's a lot of similarities in some ways. I do think that maybe the first thing that would come to my mind when I think about an artist versus an architect would be their freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I do feel like artists because they're most likely self-driven. Like they're not, even maybe they're commissioned by someone to make a piece. They're most likely self-driven by things that are of their own interest and that what pushes them to create their art.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they're making the rules and they're kind of deciding how they want to express what they have to say, how long they want to take to express what they have to say, what medium they want to use,
mm-hmm.
and in what way do they want to do that. Where architects, most of us, maybe a handful of us aren't, but most of us are commissioned to produce the work of architecture that we're producing. Therefore, we have to provide certain responses to the person who commissioned us in what we're expressing, which means that our expression is somewhat limited or directed in one way or the other.
But isn't that the same thing as with an artist? Like if I hire an artist to create X thing for me.
Yeah, and that's also why a lot of artists don't do commission work, because they don't like to be told how they should create, right?
Right.
Or they don't like to have that constraints because it just forces their mind to switch one way or the other.
Well, it is, yeah. I think all these things that you mentioned are tied together. So, the fact that the architect is responding to a lot of different constraints and factors and pieces of information very much is the beginnings of a very interesting building, for sure, and is the beginnings of freedom. Like working with constraints and creating something magical from that is what we do. But they are constraints. Like they do outline a direction. Now, the architect defines the direction through synthesizing all that information, but it does outline and point towards something. It's not from nothing. It's a weird thing because I think architecture is more about, again, synthesizing many different things. And one way you could describe that too is synthesizing one's own natural tendencies and interest as an architect, as a creative person, with the ingredients that come with the project, right? And I think we've said this before, like a lot of architects like to say, well, I approach every project is different. Every project is different, and that's how I work, because every project has a different site, takes place in a different climate, different point in time in history, program, right? All these things make a building unique. So the building is meant to be unique, and that's what the building is. And I've always maintained that that's not really the case.
But you come up with your own biases, even if those are unique. Right?
Yeah, your biases, your own skill sets, your own preferences toward things, your way of viewing the world. I mean, you're one of the pieces of the ingredients, and you can't get away from that, despite architects claiming they're always doing that, right? It's like, that's not the case. That's not the case, because it's very different if you design it versus if Hadid's office were to design it versus Meyer's office versus someone else. Like, it can produce different results. So I think architecture is interesting because you have really this game of this mashup of all this different stuff that the artist or the creative person, the architect, has to wrestle with that, and then in the end out comes this kind of hybrid baby that's a result of all of these things. Mm-hmm. Where for an artist, like you said, it's much more pure in the traditional artist sense, where they have a set of questions and interests and philosophies, and they're just drawn toward asking things, and then they try to express those things through whatever medium that feels the most appropriate for them as a person, right? And also for that particular thing they're trying to state. And they could it could be sculpture, it could be painting, it could be performance art, it could be video, it could be anything, really.
And even the process, I mean, like right now we're talking about the final result, right? Like the final art piece and the final building, and comparing to each other. But even the process to get to those final things is, to me, much more free for an artist than it is for an architect. Because, despite architects having their different ways to think conceptually or work through their design process, having like different kinds of design process, at some point the architectural process is somewhat standardized.
Yeah.
Like we have to use certain tools, we have to use graphic representations that, work across every single office in the same country. We have to use, units that everybody can understand. Like there is standards that we have, there is those languages that we have to use to express ourselves toward the final end results. When an artist could decide to have a complete different process for every piece of art that they're creating. And I suspect that that's the case because most artists work individually, right? They're like a one-man show, one-woman show, one whatever show, right? So they do not have to comply to this set of rules of using standard for their creative thoughts to be understood by other people on their project. I think that's also why we're using standard in our industry, is that we're not the only actors of our own projects. Mm-hmm. We are the creators, but we're not necessarily the producers. That
makes total sense. And what's weird is if we talk about working with clients or non-architects understanding architecture and the process of creating architecture, the standardization of process, and one aspect, like the technical aspect of like units and conveying information to contractors and all of that more executable things, clients and the general public, they don't touch that. They don't mess with that. Because they understand that it's technical probably. And it's like, yeah, you have your process. It makes sense. You need to have your drawings. You have sections. I don't know what that means, but fine. You have sections. You have schedules of materials. You have these detailed drawings that you do that are from different views. Fine. Like that's your area of expertise. I'm not going to criticize that. I'm not going to critique that. I'm not going to have an opinion about that.
It's like science, right? Like you don't question it.
I just trust you on that because it is part of what every architect does as part of this construction industry. But the part of the process that is also standardized to a degree is the design process. It's standardized in that process, you are going to be asking the same fundamental 6 questions every single architect will ask when they're doing a project. Those are the big topics, right? Of party, site response, program, sustainability, circulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, all of those things, as part of the design process, they will be covered. It might happen in a different order, but they're there. So there is a standardized aspect to the design process. Yet, of the design process compared to the technical execution process that I described earlier, the design process is the part where everybody has an opinion. Everybody who's not an architect has an opinion. They'll make a critique. They think that they can do it as well. They have a thought. They have an idea of how it can go. Well, I think we should do this next or do that next, or why don't we jump to materials? Why don't we jump to that? And I don't know what this means, but it's interesting to me, right? Because they're both standardized in a certain sense in terms of like the things you have to cover. Yet this half of it, everyone can poke at it and have thoughts. This other half, no one touches that. No one ever talks about, like, our construction documents. No one's ever like, let me look at your construction documents and critique that and have an opinion about that. But when it comes to design or even process, it's like, well, why don't we try this instead? And it's an odd thing.
I think it's just a matter of laziness. I mean, it's the same if you think about an artist who, I don't know, if you ask Vincent van Gogh, you imagine like people, nitpicking on his design process of, I don't know, like one of his paintings and be like, you know what, I don't really like the orange over here. I think we should probably like replace it with a purple. It might be like, okay, that's your opinion. But nobody's talking about like how many brush strokes does that orange is going to need? And like, is it better off on this side or of this side? Mm-hmm. Or like, what if I change it to a different brush stroke? How is that going to, have repercussion on the final project?
I guess what it comes to is a perceived understanding of the thing. So the more you don't understand something, the more, at some point, the more likely you are to not mess with it.
Yeah.
Because you don't even know where to start. You don't know how to understand it, right? Like when you go to a dentist or an orthodontist and they say, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, they might explain it to you and you're like, yeah, sure, man. That's fine. I have to trust you because I really don't know. And I think that same feeling happens when it gets to, let's say, construction documents as a specific example. But when it's design process, it's a little bit easier for people to think that or imagine they can have an opinion and weigh in on how many brushstrokes should be made. Or maybe you start with you should do like a sketch first, or I think we should do more sketches before you do the painting, or this and that and whatever. And it is an odd thing because I would describe both as being sciences. They're just different types of sciences, and both are equally difficult to master, and both are equally technical. It's just that one has this feeling about it that I could step in as a what do you call it? A non-professional and just have a crack at it, and I think it'll probably turn out just as well. But your comment about the freedom in different mediums and materials is kind of an interesting one, right? Because I think as an artist, again, you're kind of plagued by certain ideas. Maybe it's one idea, right? And your objective and your mission is just to find ways to communicate that idea. And it takes practice. I think it was it Tristan that we had on the show? Tristan Eaton? Someone we were talking to who was an artist was saying that that's one of the joys for them is that when they start off in their process, it is with a question or an idea. But at that point, when that seed is planted, they don't know how it's going to be expressed. It might be, again, sculpture, it might be painting, it might be a small industrial design object. It might be fake cereal boxes that he puts in a grocery store. It might be like he doesn't quite know yet. And then somehow over time, okay, yes, I should be using this medium to express that idea. And it's right. Like artists have like so much, because they could do anything. They're an artist. Like what difference does it make? They could do whatever they want. But it made me think that, made me question, like, are architects really more limited in their medium, or do architects limit themselves based on their preconceptions of what a building should be?
Well, it's interesting, right? If you think about the arts comes in many forms, right? Like you mentioned, like music, dance, painting, writing, sculpture, performance. Like it has the category arts has many branches, right? The category architecture seems to be limited to buildings.
Seems to be.
Like we've decided that architecture has to be buildings. But it is an interesting thing, actually. Like what, and it also goes back to the question of what is a building.
Yep.
Like are we all just working and producing architecture in the one form architecture could be? Is there like 10 other forms that could also be architecture that has not been explored? I don't know. Like what does it mean to create like there is different kinds of building. What are those kinds? Are they just different because they're used differently by people in them, or are they different because they are spatially and conceptually thought about differently or built completely different theoretical approach, right? It's a very interesting question.
So if someone were to ask me what architecture is, and we're not using the most generic basic term of architecture, which can be applied to like software architects and whatever other types of architects, but we're talking about architects, like practicing architects like us, then it's the profession of designing and creating physical structures and things that serve some kind of purpose and have obviously an emotional and spatial quality to it. But that's kind of it. Like it doesn't have to. But then
is that a pitfall though for like anyone to be able to say that they're doing architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to be an architect to actually create or do architecture. It's not common. Well, it also gets into the question of like capital A architecture versus lowercase architecture versus building. What I'm saying is like the architecture as a thing, right, is not. So when people say building, there's two images that come to my mind, and it's probably the same for most people. You either see a house, it's a front elevation of a house with a pitched roof and a little chimney and a front door, right? That's like that's a house. Or a building is some kind of squarish rectangle thing with a bunch of windows. It's maybe 5 stories tall and has a grid, and that's like building. It's like a cartoon building, right? But what I'm saying is architecture is not just those two things. It's anything physically that's created that has some kind of program, component to it, and has therefore other qualities as well. So sidewalks are architecture, furniture is architecture. It's all architecture, just of different scales and different types, but that's what it is. And the reason why I say physical is I do delineate that between like metaverse architecture and whatnot. Like, you're getting into a different space over there, or video game architecture. Like architecture within our profession, what we do is physical stuff, but it's not defined to, it doesn't have to be enclosed in an envelope and be, have a mechanical system for it to be architecture. A landscape element that's a floating partition wall in the middle of a forest, it's architecture, provided that it has some kind of programmatic aspect to it. So with that being the definition, though, the medium or the materials, let's say, of architecture could be anything, right? And I think that, so in some sense, the idea that the artist is more free than the architect is not true if we're talking about what the architect could dream of in design, is maybe true if we talk about the realities of what the architect is commissioned to do. If you're designing a hospital, you're not making the hospital out of wire and curtains. You're making it out of concrete and steel and HVAC systems. There's that aspect. But I think in terms of dreaming of architecture and designing it, I don't think we're limited.
I think the word dreaming is interesting because, in the question of freedom, I think architects play in the real world, where artists have the freedom to not necessarily play completely in the real world.
Oh yeah, no, of course.
Which is probably like one of the biggest differences in their freedom, right?
Yeah.
Like we are dealing with concrete materials, we're dealing with people and safety and performances and long lasting and earthquakes and all of those things. Artists are not having to deal with a lot of those things.
Yeah, that's true. But I think but I think the best architecture is the architecture that doesn't allow those realities to dictate what the building or the architecture should be. It very much pushes against that and says, why can't you have a facade that's made of chain link fence? Why can't you have a space that's defined by just a curtain instead of having a partition wall, right? Like,
and
why
I think
can't
it's
this wall
interesting
turn into
because
a bench?
I
right?
do feel like in some ways, like when we go visit like older buildings, that were built in like, I don't know, early 1900s or like the 50s or whatever, they feel to me that those are more like art pieces or art/architecture pieces than the ones I'm visiting that are completed today. And it's probably because that the weight of the reality wasn't as apparent in the final piece.
I could see that, yeah.
Which is kind of like, I don't want to sound like a nostalgic, but in some ways, like, what are we doing then?
It's partly because things have become more so. The building systems, or building construction has become so much more sophisticated. So there's a lot more nuance to it now, which is a good thing from a performance standpoint. But it just makes the technical aspect of designing structures so much higher. And again, it just occupies more time. I mean, even a lot of, in California or Southern California specific, Northern California too, you have a lot of really cool post and beam structures that were part of the, call it mid-century, period. And they're really, really cool things. Can't do that now unless you use steel, but steel is really expensive. So unless you have a major budget, you can't do that. Like, you're limited because of code. You have seismic things, you have energy things, you have all this stuff that just it does limit you, and you have to find very creative ways to push back against that so you don't create something else that's just another cookie cutter, basic thing you've seen repeated so many times. I think actually that's, now that you say that, that's probably one of the, in the long term, the biggest challenges of the profession is how do we keep being innovative while our reality that we operate within is becoming more and more restrictive. And I know we love architects are good at working with restrictions and blah, blah, blah. That's true. But, at some point, it just sucks the life out of you. It's hard. So I think that long term, that's going to be a big question.
What if you have $100 to create the piece of architecture and you spend like 90 of them, figuring out those requirements and standardized things you have to provide, then that means you only have 10% left. To do the creative part.
And it's not just time too, depending on the scale of the team, it's also the emotional exhaustion and just fatigue, right? Yeah. If you work, I was going to say 9 hours a week, if you work 90% and at the end of that 9% you're tired, it's really hard to then switch your brain and be like, okay, let's be fun, elevated, creative, happy mode, because being creative when you're happier it's proven that those are tied. So I'm going to do that now and like not worry about all these constraints that I'm aware of, just shake it all off and forget all about the stuff that I have to actually deal with and just be free. It's really hard to do.
You can do it for a split second, but then you still have to go back to
and then you go back and like, ugh, look at that pile of information, and just put that aside, ignore that pile of information. Go over here to this other space. Oh, monitor, free, clean Rhino space. There's nothing there. I can do whatever I want. I kind of speculate also that maybe as a result of these shifts, it'll be more common for architecture offices to be split by tasks and expertise. So I do think having a construction technology, that's not technology, but a technical construction individual makes sense. Having one that specializes in probably understanding codes and permitting and zoning, it makes sense. And then energy. I think things are becoming more and more specialized because the amount of information one has to know about each of those things is so great. And I just listed like 2 or 3 of probably 6 that I don't know if it's possible to be a one person architecture shop and consistently do really innovative work at a certain scale. If you do one every 5 years, fine, but that's impractical and that's difficult, and you're not going to make a living doing that. So, but I think having the specialist is going to be more of the thing, just to contend with all these factors, and for each of those people to think critically and creatively about the thing that they're looking at, rather than having a one master architect who does it all. I think that was easier to do when there were less restraints, but now with all the things we have to respond to, there's no way.
The other thing, I think, the differences between architecture and art is maybe in the asking of questions. And I think in the type of questions that each decide to be asking, and also if they're actually proposing an answer or if they're just questioning. Like arts oftentimes is, it could be like about posing personal questions, things that, relate to your own story as an artist, like your background, where you come from, or things that you've been struggling as a person, right? Could be a motivation to create your art. It could be things that are more like about politics, and provocation in reaction. So art could be questioning those things or react to those things. Sometimes it's not necessarily questioning, it's just a gut reaction that's expressed in the form of arts. Architecture usually, I feel like usually poses questions that are less personal. Oftentimes it's much more for like the collective aspect of posing questions, like society, so like bigger questions, and he's always trying to propose something. I feel like buildings rarely pose the building itself is an answer to the question that was posed in some ways. Otherwise, I don't know what that building would look like if it wasn't an answer.
So I agree with this. This is, I think, to me, the fundamental difference between art and architecture, artists and architects. As artists, they exist to poke at society and ask questions, and what they produce only exists to do that. It doesn't actually offer any practical solutions to things. It's just asking questions, whether they be on whatever topic it might be. That's all they exist as a person. That's why they exist. That's why their artwork exists. That's kind of it. Architecture, though, is strange because we should be, when we can, also asking big societal questions, that putting a mirror to society, so to speak. But at the same time, we do need to propose something that will be of use. It doesn't just exist as a big question statement. It has to perform and provide something useful. And oftentimes, the questions that we are asking are related to the thing that we're proposing. So if we're designing a school, and maybe the questions we're asking in the architecture has to do with, how do we educate our children? What does that process look like? How can we do it better? How can we do it differently, right? We're critiquing, and we're asking questions about the existing school and education system, like an artist would do. Except our medium is not, a big picture of a baby crying with a big Crayola over its head or whatever an artist would do. Our creation is at least an attempt to provide a solution which does actively address the question we're asking, which is, how do we make education better? How do we change it for now and the future, so that education, so students understand, young kids learn more about life and the cycle of, farming and growing food and eating and existing on this planet and part of this ecosystem. Well, we can create classrooms and a school design that actually proactively, proposes students to learn in a certain manner. And so they're very, very different things in that regard, super, super different things. Do we always get to have architecture that expresses those questions and the answers quite clearly? No. Is it really hard to do that? Yes, of course. But architecture at its best, it does do that, even on the scale of a house. You're questioning the standard modes of living. and what makes sense for this particular nuclear family, or it makes sense for these set of people if it's a multifamily house, or if it's low-income housing, or whatever it is. You're questioning what's wrong about the way it's been done in the past. What's wrong about how we perceive the homeless people when we design a homeless shelter, right? I'm not creating a sculpture. I'm creating something that actually performs to do what I'm seeking out to do. I'm not trying to say that architects are somehow higher or better than artists. That's not what I'm saying here.
It's a different thing.
But it's a different thing, right? And with that, though, comes a lot of constraints. We a lot of times architects and architecture cannot be quite as, I wouldn't say powerful. That's not the right word. It can't be quite as punchy. It can't really, be like in your face.
I was gonna say, like provocation in art is very common,
yes,
right? And actually, it's oftentimes, I would say, what makes the artwork the most successful or appealing to people is it's provocative. Like finally, somebody is saying what they think about this matter, and is saying it out loud, and is putting it out there, and is not afraid, right? Mm-hmm. Architecture rarely does that. I feel like architecture is rarely provocative. Mm-hmm. Maybe because it's a discipline where people are maybe too responsible in some ways. It's serious.
Yeah,
it's serious,
is.
And therefore it can really be as humorous or shocking or putting off people.
Yeah.
If the goal of a building of architecture is to like put off people, it's because I've rarely seen that. It's either because the architecture failed and it was not intended that people are
like the goal of it, or in the end
the goal of it.
Okay.
It's the goal of architecture is always to be well received by as many people as we can.
Oh, is it? I don't know about that.
I feel like it's...
I disagree.
I feel like it's what's expected of architecture.
What's expected of architecture versus what architecture should be trying to do are not necessarily the same thing.
I'm not saying that's what architecture should be trying to do.
Okay.
I'm just saying that that's what architecture is expected to be doing.
I see. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Where in some ways, art is expected to be provocative.
That's true.
If art isn't provocative, then
people, I think it's still art, but people think like, oh, it's not art.
My grandma could do it. Like,
right.
It's not. It miss that characteristic, right? But if you think about it, actually, it would be very interesting to see art that is very serious, and what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And it would be very interesting to see architecture that is very provocative, and off-putting and repulsive. And again, it has happened with buildings, but I don't think it was necessarily the intention to start with. It's often a result.
The intention of the architect or the intention of the client, different things also. Sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not.
Yeah,
so what I'm saying is that I see a chart, a chart with quadrants, right? You have like a cross, you have 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4 in a quadrant. You have art and architecture, 2 separate columns. The bottom, it both says, so you have art on the right side, and it says, call it basic art that's not provocative, okay? Generic, non-provocative art. On the bottom also, on the other side, on the left side, you have architecture that is generic, non-provocative architecture. The top 2, in the top row, the same things, right? The upper right is art, provocative art, then you have provocative architecture on the left. What's interesting about that graph is if you were to circle the public's perception generally of what each of those should be doing to be good architecture or good art, or what is architecture, what is art, they'd be in opposite diagonal corners. Art would be provocative. That's what it should be doing. If it's not provocative, it's not art. Architecture should be sort of, let's say, appealing to the masses. It should perform. It should be just providing like function. It's shelter. It's all that kind of stuff. It's not meant to be looking weird and provocative. It's meant to be servicing, and it's in the bottom left, and they're completely different. When that's a kind of a false statement, because I don't think art necessarily has to be provocative in order for it to be art. And architecture, true architecture, is not in the bottom left-hand corner. It's in the upper left-hand corner. It is provocative in some way, even if it's not visually provocative.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of architecture. And assuming what I've said is true, and I think it is, that does outline a very big difference in public perception between what we do and whatever other creative professions or artists do. And that's probably the struggle, right? It's like we're always trying to convince people, of what we as a profession and as a group of experts are trying to do.
But I think it also comes from like where, the let's say the client or the general public is coming from. What is their realm of reference?
Mm-hmm.
If you're from a small town and you don't know Dada, you don't know like all of the like big artistic movement, you only know your local guy who does watercolor of like landscape. That's to you, that's what art is, because that's all you know. And it's the same with architecture. If you grew up in the suburbs and all you see is cookie cutter house, you think that's what architecture is. It's just plain, vanilla, non-provocative, building. It's just.
So this is also where, for me, I think there are lines. If we understand art and architecture and folks' preconceptions of what they mean based on what we were just talking about, I think then the lines between the two have to be blurred, and they should be perceived as being closer to the same thing. Like architecture, yes, it provides some kind of function and utility, and you can use it for some purpose. And ideally, the building is designed in an artful manner that critiques how we typically do that activity. If it's a restaurant, maybe we eat differently in this restaurant. Why does a restaurant have to be formatted this way? Why don't we do it differently because of the chef? But I also think in the context of like a city, right? The average person will not like really wacky architecture. They will reject it. But the city is just a large scale collection or petri dish or example of what we're creating as a species anyway. So yeah, let's throw in some cool, weird stuff. That's what we're here to do. I mean, we don't all want to be driving the same boring looking car or wearing the same clothes. We're going to have different stuff going on. We're here to, as a group, just to express things and to try stuff. Like, why not? And I think that's also a very powerful understanding of architecture, that it's not just a building. No, we're creating we're making something, and this thing that we're making materially is no different than art or clothing or watches or cars. It's all stuff. Like, why don't we make it this stuff also interesting? Nothing's saying that this stuff, because it's a building, has to be boring. Like, that's not true. I don't know why we place the same constraints on our ideas of buildings.
It's interesting. I feel like even in our modes of living, in our lifestyles, we're pretty conforming. Like, I really would like clients to come up with like weird requests. But like, weird one that really would make what it means to design a house and live in a house like very different. Like, they really want to experiment in how they live. Like, what if you had a client who's like, I don't believe in bedrooms.
Yeah.
So forget about building code and permitting and resale value and whatever.
Windows.
Put a pin in that for a moment. But what if you had a client who said that, who's like, I don't believe in sleeping in a box, in a room, have a family and I have this and that, but I would want a house where there is no boxed bedroom. And that would be a fantastic thing, right? Because I think that's also where you can again. I think one of the similarities between architecture and arts is the notion of innovation and experimentation, right? They're both trying to come up with something, to create something new, or question something and look at it in a different way, right? With what we do, designing homes, for example, like, it's very easy to just comply to the conventions and just do what's been done for a zillion years and apply forward.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very cool when you have a client who wants something done just a little bit differently, because it does create that possibility of doing not just what's expected, but the unexpected.
And that's actually also what's taught in school, right? I don't know if it was the same way for you, but when I was in school, and it's mostly the same now, is you don't start off in year one designing a library or a hospital. You might know like once or twice, but you start with doing kind of small abstract things. And usually the first, quote, building you're doing or architecture doing is, again, it's not a building as I described it, the house or the enveloped, office size kind of grid structure. It's some kind of like space, like you're doing a sensory spa for the blind, something like that. And the reason why those assignments are given is because you're dealing with architectural stuff, but you're embedded into the program is a questioning of what is a spa for blind people, and you have no choice as the architect or as a student to question the norms because that is part of the brief. So this is part of the training, and then what happens is later on when you're giving a more generic brief, like in third or fourth year, okay, now design a homeless shelter. Right? You have to take that thinking you've learned and apply it to the homeless shelter, which means to say that you take your way of critiquing or thinking differently and apply it to this very, very pragmatic, very real, very serious set of constraints and program to understand and unpack how it can be done differently. And that's the magic of the architects. I think that magic oftentimes, unfortunately, wears away over the years because of the difficulties of the profession. For architects, it's also once you practice, you start working with clients. So I think a lot of architects, they don't do that. They don't employ that thinking, and they just default to what does the client want, and I'll make it look pretty.
That, and also because they feel pressure to, oftentimes, unfortunately, by the client to move quickly. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the process of creation is not 1 + 1 = 2. It's not that linear and that simple. Mm-hmm. You would not expect an artist to, come up with the final design of their masterpiece in 2 months. You can't put a timeline on like how long it's going to take them to get to the point where they need to be. And I'm not saying that every piece of architecture is a masterpiece that needs to take forever. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that creation is not it's not science, it's not things that you have a proper formula, you put it together and here is the result. Like there's a lot more that goes into that.
I think there is a process and there's a science to it, but I think there's more pockets of looseness, and there are pockets within the process where they're just complete unknowns. You don't know what's going to happen in that space. So practically speaking, right, obviously, we know how long it takes to design a house roughly because we've done enough in the past, so we can give you a timeline of like it's going to take about this much time. But when you become more fine grained about things, it becomes more difficult, right? Because sometimes to resolve this thing in the building, it takes 2 weeks to figure it out. Other times, you figure it out in an hour.
Yeah, and what I mean with time is that, I think. Like when you've been doing, let's say, your art or your architecture for some time, you have an idea of roughly like how much time it would take to get you to where you need to be, right? But I think people should respect the fact that it takes time for things to be thought and designed, right? So I could tell you that, this handrail is going to be done in 2 weeks. I can't tell you exactly how many hours it's going to take me because I might need 2-3 extra hours in order to, fine tune those specific details. The same thing would go for a painter who's doing a painting, who's thinking, I can have that painting done in 2 months. I might need an extra week because I want to refine some of the brush strokes. I want to add a little bit of light here and there. I want to give it a final coat so it's protected, and I think also because we live in a society where, time is efficiency and money. Everything has to be shortcutted. And I think a lot of people think maybe of architecture as a service that could be done quickly because you've been doing it for many years and you're good at it and you can crank it, that therefore it has to be efficient. And you can be efficient, but there's still a respect that needs to exist for that efficient time to happen.
Are you stating that generally people value and understand and respect the amount of time an artist needs to create an artwork, but they don't have that same understanding or misunderstanding of what it takes to design a building?
Yeah, and it might also come down to basically how you're paying those people. Let's say you're paying the painter a fixed fee for that painting to be like X thousands of dollars. That's what you're paying for. Therefore, yeah, you want them to take as much time as it takes because that's, you know already how much it's going to cost. Architects, let's say you're paying them hourly, you're going to maybe want to like make sure you don't go over a certain number of hours, right? So you're trying to cap that design process within those numbers of hours. And I think that's kind of the wrong mentality. Because it's not that easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think capping time makes sense because we all have deadlines. I think the micromanaging again is probably the part you're critiquing more than anything else. But in the case of how architecture fees are set up, it's an interesting one because, you know, I'm pretty I don't know, but I feel like most artists, when they're commissioned to do something, they're paid a fixed fee as probably like a third up front or something, then pay the remainder upon delivery or before delivery.
Yeah.
And you don't pay an artist for time, how many hours it takes you to create this painting. You just pay for the painting. That's also one of the benefits of doing a fixed fee, right? If during the design process is that no one's asking you to track your time. No one's going to nitpick at your time because as long as you hit the final deadline or come close to it, they don't care, right? Fine, you spent 50 hours doing it. Okay, fine. Oh, you spent 1 hour doing it. Okay, doesn't matter to me. It's the same amount of money I'm spending, and you're still going to deliver at the end roughly the same date. The problem is, in our profession, is architects are generally undervalued. So 95% of the time when architects get paid a fixed fee, it's not enough. And they end up burning through hours. I wouldn't even say burning through hours because it makes it sound like you're wasting hours. They end up using the hours they would need to use to do the building, but the fee's not enough to cover it per time. Because unfortunately, everything we do is measured against time, and everyone in the end of it, we all get paid based on time per year is the usual way that it works, right? So it tends to be that working hourly, in fact, is oftentimes for the architect and in a way for the client, but let's say for the architect, the best fee structure, because you at least know that you're not going to be losing money, which is for sure a risk with the fixed fee route.
Yeah, and I think that's also why a lot of artists struggle because, you know, you do want to give your best work, but you agree to that fixed amount at the beginning. And as an artist, you don't necessarily know how long and what the process is going to be like for you to get to the final piece.
And now a little break for our show sponsors. If you're starting to laser scan your renovation projects for accurate as-builts, you'll want to hear this. Imagine that you've been awarded a big project, but not surprisingly, your client hands over wonky CAD drawings from 17 years ago. No worries. Meet Integrated Projects, or IPX for short. IPX is a scan-to-BIM platform that converts your 3D point cloud file, which is produced from any major LiDAR camera, into standardized BIM and CAD files. The best part is that they lay out the price and turnaround time instantly. That means starting your interior renovation project on the 50-yard line with an accurate set of drawings in 3D and 2D. Click the IPX link in our show notes to launch the platform for free. We are supported by Enscape. Enscape is a fast and easy-to-use real-time visualization and VR tool for the AEC industry. Enscape is not a standalone application. Instead, it's a plugin, which makes things much easier. It plugs into Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, and Vectorworks. With Enscape, you can create realistic renderings, 360-degree panoramas, and videos, and you can even immerse clients in VR to give them a deeper understanding of their building. Enscape is used by more than 500,000 monthly users worldwide from over 150 countries. So if you want a fast and user-friendly real-time visualization experience, then click on the Enscape 3D link in our show notes. Dear listeners, are you attending Autodesk University 2024 this October? If not, you should. The Design and Make Conference of the Year brings together creatives from architecture, engineering, construction, product design, manufacturing, media, and entertainment. The digital experience is free, but if you attend in person, you will cross paths with esteemed colleagues, talk and network, learn new technologies, and forge new connections. You will have access to workshops, theater talks, and classes where you can gather insights and knowledge to take back to your firm. The Design and Make Conference is in San Diego this year from October 15th to the 17th. Register at the Autodesk University link in our show notes. Yeah, the difference with art and architecture in this part of the conversation, though, is that an artist and a work of artwork has potential for its value and its worth to exponentially grow. 10x, 30x, 40x what they started, 50x, 100x what it started off as being, right? As an artist,
if they are successful, yeah.
But there's that potential. As an architect, the services we provide, no matter how good we are, we're not going to be able to charge 10, 30, 40, 100x in the future. It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah, but I also don't think there isn't that many artists that can charge that much. Out of like all of the artists, only the ones that maybe end up in like the big museums can do that. But like any, normal level artist is probably playing in the same level.
No, of course. But what I'm stating is that's why a fixed fee model can work for an artist, because there is that potential. It could happen. And you might not get to the
But it can also for an
mainstream
architect,
art.
you just have to charge that more.
No, not going to happen. There's no architect who's charging, let's say, mid-range fees, who after X years of practicing and they become the best one in the world, they're not going to be able to charge 30, 40, 100x of their original fee. Not going to work. An artist, you can though, right? You can give an artist $1 million to create something for you, because that artwork is going to be worth 30 million or 50 million or 100 million or whatever it's going to be. It's perceived differently versus the value of the architecture. It's not there.
Yeah, but if you're a star architect, you can charge a lot more than if you're not a star
It's
architect.
not going to be the scale of the artist though.
Yeah,
right?
but because it's valued differently. Real estate and art are valued differently. But proportionally to how they're valued, they can still charge more. The artist can charge 100x because the art is valued at 100x. Real estate isn't, but the real estate is valued at 10x. Therefore, a star architect could charge probably 10x.
10x is possible when you're developing a property, yes, but the scales are. Yeah, I feel like you're just repeating what I said. So, but that's the thing though. The scales are different, right? And an architect, you're going to have a really hard time convincing a client to pay you 10x because you're going to increase their property value by 10x. It just doesn't happen.
But it's the same with an artist. That's like, if you compare a medium level artist and a medium level architect, I think it's going to be the same problem for both of them. I think only like the top tier could do a certain thing. I think the medium tier, they're still capped to how much they can charge.
But we're talking about the difference between the pros and cons of, and now we're talking about fees, the pros and cons of fixed fee models versus hourly. I'm saying as an artist, you can afford to do fixed fee because there is the potential, if you get good enough and become famous and whatever else, that you are able to charge crazy high prices and make a lot of money. And this understanding of art can be applied very easily to musicians, right? Like you could get to that level. Is it uncommon? Yes, but you could do it. As an architect, you can become the best of the best in your profession, right? But the dollars don't translate, right? It's not the same thing. If you create a hit pop song, it's worth, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars, right? And it could be that making that one song and the time you spend as an artist is only worth a couple $100,000 with the amount of time you put into it, let's say, right? As an architect, though, the scales are so different. Like you don't have that potential to do like a one-hit wonder that's going to be worth tens of millions of dollars because of the architecture itself. This goes back also to how we value architecture and it being tied to basically real estate and property value. So therefore, what the architect charges is related to the final outcome. And even if that property is going to be worth 10x, like you said, you're developing a property that you bought it for, let's say $1 million, you put a house on it or whatever, now it's worth 10. As the architect of that development property, I don't know any architect or any developer who's going to pay an architect a 10x their normal fee because the property is going to be worth 10x. It's just like, it never, ever happens. That's why for architects, it tends to be the fixed fee, the hourly model is better because you're at least making good money for the time you put in, but you're not going to be making the equivalent of, $50,000 in an hour of time because you wrote a one-hit wonder. That doesn't work that way in this profession. Is it right? Is it wrong? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think that's the reality.
So basically become an artist, not an architect. That's what you're saying.
The other difference too is that
because your chances of become rich and famous is probably higher if you're an artist than if you're an architect.
I don't know if the chances are higher, but to the extreme degree, yes, you can achieve that. Like, everyone wants to be an actor or a rock star, right? Your chances are really not very high. But that ceiling, that glass ceiling for those professions is way, way up there. The glass ceiling for architects is way, way down here. Having said that, because we are a profession and we do what we do, the whole mid-range tier that you were talking about, the mid-range architect, whatever that means, is for sure making more money and has a much more stable life than the mid-range artist. Because we are, like, you could become an architect, you could work at a big office like HOK or whatever. You could do good architecture and you could make a decent living. You're not super wealthy, but you're making a decent living and you got benefits and all this stuff. As an artist, of the same kind of tier, if we could somehow figure out that graph, probably a lot more difficult for you than working at HOK.
For sure, if you have a 9-to-5 job with stable benefits, it seems like it's probably an easier lifestyle than if you don't, right?
Yeah.
One of the similarities of art and architecture is that both disciplines, end up making something. I think the only difference, again, is that on one end, and I guess that also depends, but like on one end in the arts, well, I was gonna say, and on one end, like, you can make an art piece just by being one person. For architecture, you do need a crew, but really it's not necessarily true depending on what kind of art you're making. If you're making a musical, you can't be a one-man show. Like, you have to be a team. If you're making a movie, you can be a one-person show. It's a team. So really, like, arts englobes a whole lot of things. If it's one painting, you might have one person. You might also have 5 assistants helping you paint that thing, depending on its scale. So my point is kind of obsolete. I guess both disciplines are making things. that's the similarity.
No, but look, you can always find exceptions to like whatever the conversation is, and I don't think we need to worry about that so much. I mean, that it's true what you said, but at the same time, it's very easy to imagine that generally as an artist, you do have the capacity to create artwork on your own. Go out, buy some clay, go out, buy some paintbrushes and some paint, go out, dig through dumpsters and find objects and then make something from it. As an architect,
you could do
like
that too.
An actual architect, you can do small scale stuff like furniture. And I did say that furniture counts as architecture, and it does. But let's say we're talking about architecture, that there's a building that someone's going to be inside of that building for some purpose. No, you cannot do it on your own. Yeah, you could go buy the materials and build it and whatnot, sure, but that's not really a practical way of existing. Like an artist could produce, a painter, for example, could produce 100 paintings in a year if they wanted to, and they could do it all on their own with the cost of paint, which would be expensive, but it's manageable. An architect, you cannot go and do 100 buildings or 10 buildings or 3 buildings literally just on your own. You have to have a bunch of people with you, and also it's going to cost, again, 30, 50x of what it costs to do a painting. So I think it is a good point that there is a really big difference in terms of how we can express ourselves as creative people, and how long things take, and how much control we have over the entire process. We have a lot less control over the final outcome compared to an artist who has supreme control over the thing, even if it does require others to be involved. Like you're doing a large scale installation or you're doing something that you described, like you have control over a lot of it. We as architects, we actually have a lot of control, but it's not to that degree most of the time, because we are working with not just different people in terms of like others and a number of people, but we're working with like just so many different trades, and they have their own businesses. They're their own profession and professionals, and there's dozens of them, and it's just a long, convoluted, complicated thing. Whereas most art, when it's made, it's not nearly as complicated, even if it gets on the scale of what's that? Like Christophe, the guy who wrapped the arch. Christo, and he did some other things too. Like those are large scale, you could say complicated architectural kind of installations, but they're not. It's not like doing a building where you have fucking mechanical, electrical, plumbing, landscape, structural, energy, all this stuff. So no, I think it's a good point. They are different.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is similarities between art and architecture, but it might just be more on like somewhat the basic level of similarities. Like aesthetic, innovation, creative process, doing something that's received by someone, right? But in a way, they're also very different. I mean, if you think about it, like we talked about briefly, like art will most likely appreciate over time and be preserved and be carried through time in a more pristine way. Buildings are going to decay, they're going to depreciate, they're going to, get damaged. They're kind of like actually living in opposite direction, right? I feel like when artwork is being produced, that's when its life is starting. And in some ways, when architecture is finished, that's where it starts to not die, because it can last, but that's actually where in a way starts to perish in terms of the physical world.
I think you could also describe that same thing in the opposite manner, where when a work of art is done, it's not as death, but it's done. Like it doesn't change ever. And actually the goal, if it's depending on the artwork, is for it to stay exactly as it is.
Yeah, like you restore it if it gets damaged.
It's supposed to be
remodel it.
Like that. Some artwork does have a phasing kind of component to it, right? It degrades over time or whatever, and there is that. But like there's a very defined understanding of the life of the artwork, and a lot of times it's just being preserved as a pristine, perfect thing. Then that's what it is. Versus architecture, it kind of, when the building is done, when it's completed rather, it's not finished because it has to be used and probably morph and then get remodeled and get changed over time or degrade or whatever it is. Like it has this other component to it where it changes. Yes, it can degrade.
It has a life on its own afterwards.
It has a whole, it moves with time. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. And then what's even more bizarre is you're right that the physical structure itself, let's say, lessens in quality over time because it ages. Let's say also the value of the physical structure, certain aspects of it depreciate over time. Specifically when we think about the mechanical systems, like if we look at old houses that were built in the 50s and they have to be remodeled now, like the mechanical systems of those houses have almost no value. In fact, they're the opposite of value. They're problematic in a lot of cases, right? So that's one aspect of the architecture, two aspects that kind of degrade and devalue over time. Yet if it's really high quality design and becomes cherished, then there's the art component where the design itself goes up in value because it's now a historical thing. And then even in a way detached from all of that too is the real estate value, which does grow over time, just naturally, that's the way real estate works. So it's a very strange thing with architecture because you have all of these different layers that are in one thing, but they have different tracks to them. Different, like some of them degrade, some of them depreciate, some of them appreciate, and they're not necessarily related to each other.
So I guess not in a summary, but after talking about all those things, do you think that art and architecture, or architecture is art? Because that's often one of the questions that we get.
Is architecture art? I think architecture has the privilege of being art and other stuff. So I wouldn't say it's not art, because it is, but it's not only art. I think it's both things. Because to me, again, if I think about like if you're at a bird's eye level, you just look at everything that's down there where the humans are. There's physical stuff we make, and I just don't see any reason why physical stuff of this X category should not be as provocative and as questioning and as whatever else as this other physical stuff. Just because it has a functional component does not mean it cannot have the component that the thing that art offers. you know? So I think architecture, like anything else we do that has a performance aspect, it's both. It should be both. It should be art and something else, but it's not only art.
It's interesting. So architecture could be under the umbrella of, like we talked about the different branches that art, capital A, art category has, like dance, music, painting, and whatever, right? So architecture is probably one of those branches. As I feel like it's often being questioned as like, is it art or architecture? Like they're kind of like two different big disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I feel like after this conversation, you could think about like the big category art under like a big umbrella under which live a whole bunch of different forms of art, and architecture could be one of the form of art.
Yeah,
let's say like culinary art, right?
Yeah.
Or things that you eat. It's made with food. It's safe. It has to be cooked at a certain degree, right? It's like it's providing people with nutrients, which is vital. It's something that they need, but it's still a form of art because of the way it's being expressed. It's been worked. It's been designed, and all of that, right? So.
Yeah, I guess if we were to get really nitpicky about this, and it's pretty common to say for people to say that they have turned X thing into an art form, right? They're not just a chef, right? They're an artist, and it's meant to be as compliment because it's like you've surpassed normal chefs. Now you're an artist. You're this.
You're past the baseline.
That's above. But I think really, if I were to be specific about it, it is underneath the umbrella of art, but it also exists outside of that umbrella. Because for me, I think art is strictly something that does not have any, functional utility purpose to it. And that's not the point of art. You could also say the same distinction can be made about entertainment versus not entertainment. Entertainment has no reason to exist other than to entertain, and art has a similarity to it. I'm not saying art is entertainment or vice versa, but there's a similarity to it. But as soon as you have something that performs, it offers something that has to do with survival or our needs to exist, right? The fundamental needs to exist, that it's not just art. So I think architecture is both, I guess you'd say both building and art, but it's both, and it doesn't fit underneath the art umbrella only, because the art umbrella for me is something that has no purpose other than just to be art, and that's not what architecture does. But that's also why it's so cool, but it's also why it's confusing, and that's also why most people don't categorize or think about it in this way. They don't think about it as art. They think about it as building, right? Because that's also what you see all the time.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Well, if it's under the category of art, then all of the bad buildings, therefore, are not architecture, because you wouldn't say like, oh, nice piece of art. Like, is it? I don't think this is art.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's a kind of a way to, make a selection of what is and what isn't architecture.
I think one of the similarities between artists and architects and art and architecture that most people don't get is that both when they're good, are making a very clear statement about something. And I think that understanding of art is pretty obvious and clear. That's how we understand art. That's like the basic understanding of art is like, okay, the artist is trying to say something. They're making a statement through their artwork, and the statement is in front of me. Maybe I get it, I don't get it, maybe I agree with it, I disagree with it, but there's a statement being made. The idea, though, of a piece of architecture making a statement, I don't think is not the first thing people would think of. And it might even be that for some folks, they find that sort of not repulsive, but they don't feel the need for that. It's just silly. And don't make a statement with your art, just with their architecture. Just give me a building that performs in the way I want it to and looks good. Why would it have to make a statement? But the reality is, I don't mean necessarily making a statement about society, although we could do that. But the reality is that anytime you create something, it has to have some kind of thesis or spine to it. Otherwise, it falls apart. It's just I think it's one of the inherent truths of creating anything, whether it be a song, a music composition, architecture, a car, whatever. There has to be something that's trying to be said. And the clearer that statement is to the creator, and and the more robust that statement is as well, the better the outcome. I think that's definitely part of the mix. And that's a big similarity, the same thing between creating art and architecture.
Yeah, and that's also the thing that if you go to the museum but you don't read or learn about or take the audio guide to understand what the painting was about, you might miss the point completely by just looking at it. It's the same with architecture. If you don't really know what was the intention or the concept behind, you might just completely miss the point.
But there's this might be a separate question, but do you think that the art and architecture fails if it's not doesn't perform in the way it's meant to perform unless you read a plaque? Because it seems to be like that doesn't make sense, right? That in order for art to be understood and then to be received and to do what it's meant to do, one has to read a plaque. That doesn't seem to be.
No, I mean, it could. I mean, well, it depends. How do you measure success or failure? If it provoked emotion, did it succeeded? Was that the right emotion it was supposed to provoke? I don't know because I haven't read the plaque. So, if it has no reaction, then it probably failed because it was intended to make you react in some ways, or provoke some sort of emotion.
But that's the other thing too, is that I think one of the other differences.
How many people go to museums and like, oh, I love this painting, and they absolutely have no idea what this painting is about. And did the art fail or did the art succeed?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure if you ask, 50 artists, they'd all have probably different answers.
I'm sure the artist is pissed because like, well, the goal was for me to express this thing and people like it, but they actually don't like it for the reason I was hoping they would like it for, because they don't have the information to understand it and therefore like it in that way.
That's true.
Which sometimes I feel is probably one of also the biggest similarities between art and architecture is that misreading of the artist and their work by the viewer.
I have to say, and I don't know if it's my own way of thinking that's bleeding into this answer, but I think the creative at some point just doesn't care. Like you just become focused on doing the work, doing better work, becoming an expert at your craft and completing it and putting it out there. And after you put it out there, how it's read, if it's read, I don't have a whole lot of control over that. And it makes me think also, like, I love movies, so I'm always watching interview clips with actors and film directors and writers and things like that. And it's remarkable how many of them, the ones I've seen at least, the actors, their philosophy toward acting is, I read the script, I memorize, I learn the scripts, and I make up a backstory. I have all this, conceptual thinking that goes on, the rationale behind what I'm doing, like an architect would, all this rationale behind what I'm doing. And then I do my thing in front of the camera, and how people receive it, it's not on me. And it's almost like for actors, at least, like they actually, a lot of times they don't watch themselves afterwards. They don't pay attention to the critics. And it's almost like they have to actively not pay attention to what the audience, how the audience responds, how the critics respond, because it would tamper with their process and make it would dirty their process and make them now be too much in their head about what are they going to think? What are they going to think? How do I do this so they feel a certain way? And whereas a lot of the actors feel like, no, I'm just trying to be honest to what I'm doing. And if it's well received, great. If it's not, then it's not really my deal. I can't think about that side of it because it'll ruin the creative process. I think that's really interesting. Now, of course, as an architect, we don't have that ability to think that way because, again, we offer something that's practical. We can't make something and not care about how people feel about the thing or how it feels like to live in the house. Of course we care because it's a functional thing. Like it should probably feel good to be inside of the house. But I think there's some aspect to that, for sure.
Well, and if you want to improve yourself for the next work too, I think feedbacks are, you do whatever you want with those feedbacks afterwards, but knowing where maybe you've excelled or where you deeply failed could be helpful if you're trying to get better as you go by and not just do your thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. It's weird. I think one of the more challenging things about being an architect is understanding that valve of receiving feedback, being open to it and listening to it, and incorporating that feedback into so you can learn from it, but then closing that valve and not paying attention to it, or opening up a little bit so you hear it, but you don't really pay attention. You just kind of hear it in the back of your mind. And it's a very odd thing because it's very easy, I think, to open the valve too much. And then now you're just doing stuff in response to these external, things, which are, I guess, that muddying the purity of the process. It's a very tricky threshold to balance on. Going way back to the early part of the conversation, you were talking about the different mediums and materials and things that artists have to that artists have to work with, and architects having less flexibility or maybe just as much flexibility. And clearly architects, if we think about materials, that's a easy path of saying, well, it doesn't have to be concrete. It could be brick. It could be glass brick. It could be rubber. It could be mushrooms that are made into brick. It could be all curtains. It could be like chain link fence. It could be all this stuff, all this physical stuff. But I think one of the most important parts of architecture, if we think about architecture even more holistically, is the use of the architecture. So like an artist could use a physical thing to create their idea. They could also do like interpretive dance as a way to express their idea, which is this ephemeral thing that doesn't exist except for the time that it was done, and then it just doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. The dance stopped. Doesn't exist anymore. But I think actually the same thinking could be applied to architecture, because in a sense, when you're designing the architecture and you think about how people move through the space, how the space is felt, and space itself is an ingredient in the architecture, but space is not a physical thing. It's the opposite of physical things. That's also part of it. So stretching the definition of architecture, I think thinking about how one embodies, how the users embody the building, and how they feel with it and how they move throughout it, is probably just as much part of the architecture as the physical building itself. We're working on this project right now, and I was talking to someone in our office about it, and we were talking about verticality in the structure and the pros and cons, and whether or not we should express verticality in this house. And they were remarking, well, verticality, we could create it through like columns that are double heights or panels that are 2 stories tall or whatever it was. And it occurred to me as I was talking with them, like, yeah, that's an interesting idea. And we would do that for various reasons. I'm like, well, but we're already creating verticality, but the verticality is not created through the physical stuff. We're doing it through voids. Because in the project, we have all these gaps and voids, and some of them are double height. But it's not just kind of just massive double height. They're squeezed down, so they're kind of like slices in a certain sense. And it's like, well, I think sometimes we forget like the space is an ingredient in the architecture, and therefore the movement that takes place within the house also, or the building, is also part of the architecture. So I think the materials we use as architects don't even have to be physical materials. It could be other things as well. I mean, views, outward is certainly part of the alphabet and the things that we're using to create it. I mean, a view toward a particular, a tree or ocean or whatever is just as important, is just as valid, and just as much an ingredient as it is any wall that's in the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, the art forms versus the medium. There is different mediums available in architecture, which would be the materials, and then there is different art forms available in architecture, which would be like physical, light, wind, views, right? Like maybe more tied to the senses. Mm-hmm. Maybe the senses are the different ways, the different art form of architecture, Yeah,
and actually, thinking about it that way, architecture generally very freeing because every architecture you seek to create, embedded within it is all of that stuff already. And actually, the challenge is trying to figure out a way to proportion and use all of those ingredients and art forms, as you put it, to do something, because all those things are there. You can't ignore them. I mean, you can, but they're still going to be there, and they're still going to be part of this stew that's present. And if you've not addressed it, it doesn't turn out right. Where I think as an artist, you can also like be very focused, right? If you know this artwork is created to be in a gallery or it's to be in this spot, and it's let's say it's a painting for the sake of making the conversation easy. I'm not necessarily concerned about the views around the painting. I'm not concerned about people moving around the painting. I'm not concerned with sunlight hitting the painting. I'm not concerned with, shadows coming across the painting. The painting is the painting, and it's it's most often meant to be viewed in a perfect, clean, white gallery space. So that is the thing. And you're able to actually, now that I think about it, you're able to really just make it about one thing. Whereas architecture, it tends to be that if you try too hard to make it about one thing, it ends up failing in the end.
All right, so to try and sum it up.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna really do that, but there is similarities and there is differences between art and architecture. Just put it that way.
Okay, so I'm back. I'm a student in the auditorium, and now you've had this conversation with me for the last hour, and you're going to give me a summary.
No, so now I would be like, so what did you retain from what we just talked about?
Okay, let's see. I'd say, okay, so there are similarities and differences between art and architecture. Architecture is art, but it's also more than art. It's not just art. Architects and artists both think conceptually. They both are seeking to make statements, but in architecture, it's a mixture of all these other things that come together to create the outcome, whereas an artist is just me and my work. As an artist, I'm more likely to have more control over my thing and more likely to be able to produce it or small versions of it strictly on my own with ease. As an architect, that's really, really difficult to do if you're talking about buildings. Both are similar in the sense that while it's possible to give a total amount of time it takes to create the design or create the artwork, it's not easy for me to say exactly what's going to happen in what order and how many hours are spent on X, Y, and Z components because it's just a creative process. As an artist, I would have the glass ceiling for me, and the value of what I create is non-existent almost. It's way up there. As an architect, because my value is tied to the physical structure of things that will become outdated over time and the real estate value, I'm very much capped. And therefore, I don't have that potential to charge, $30 million to design like a 1,000 square foot house. But as an artist, I could charge a bunch of money to do one painting. But generally, as an architect, if I'm practicing in the general tier, I can have a more stable life.
That's pretty good.
And the two are also very different because art, for the most part, is kind of like this, as it's conceived by the artist, like that's it. That's it. That's the thing. Even if it's temporary, it's performance and it stops. There's no tampering with it. Whereas as architecture is out, it's out in the wild. It's being used by people. People are peeing on it and stuff like that. You don't know what's going to happen. Then different tenants come in and they do remodels. It's out there in the universe, part of society.
Okay, don't let people pee on your building, and don't let your tenants do remodels on your buildings either.
But it's out there. It's in the world. That's also what I was saying before. I was trying to explain, like, it's so interesting because architecture is part of, I don't know how to describe it. It's part of society. It's part of that space. It's part of like that.
It's being used.
That globe, the snow globe. It's in there. It's part of the infrastructure of living of the city. Art's not part of the infrastructure. It's just there for emotional questioning and then also entertainment. But it's not really part of the infrastructure. It's a weird thing, architecture.
All right, so hopefully we didn't confuse more people than we help them understand the differences.
I confuse myself.
You confuse me as well. All right.
Give us an outro then.
Thanks everybody for listening to this confusing episode. If you like what we do, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you can and you want to. If you like the show, please share it with your friends and family as well, your colleagues, everybody around. You can find us on the website, secondstudiopod.com. We are also, like I said, on YouTube. We're on social media, mostly Instagram, Second Studio Pod. We have the hotline 213-222-6950. You can call or send a text message. If you have any questions, any topic you want us to talk about, or any good guests you think would be nice to have on the show, please send it our way.
Yep.
And that's it. A lot more to come. Keep following us. Keep tuning in. And see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.